right, I got a question for you. How many countries do you think America has invaded? And really, how many do you think it is? 10? 15? 20? Well, business leader, historian Christopher Kelly has written a book about it. It's called America Invades. You can go to americainvades.com to get the book. Christopher, welcome to the show, my friend. How you doing?
Good morning, Josh. Great to be with you.
Good morning.
Good.
So what's the answer to that simple question? How many countries has America invaded?
Well, according to our calculations, we have invaded 85 countries in the world, which represents 44% of all the countries in the world. And then we've been militarily involved with almost all of the rest. And now when I talk about military involvements, I talk about things like, well, Portugal. We haven't invaded Portugal, but we've had bases on the Azores since World War II, and they're still there to this day. So we counted that as a military involvement. And when you look at those, we've been involved with every country in the world with only 3 exceptions. Those 3 are Andorra, Bhutan, and Liechtenstein. Those are the 3 we've missed completely.
Isn't that a little crazy?
Well, I think it's surprising. It definitely was a surprising result that we kind of got out of our research, that we have had this global reach touching almost every country in the world. Not always in a bad way, I must say. I mean, certainly our involvement in many countries has been, positive. I mean, for instance, in Portugal, that base in the Azores, the latest controversy there is that the administration would like to downsize there, but they want to keep it because it provides jobs in the Azores, which the Portuguese like to have around, even though it was a refueling base, and the refueling technology has changed because now we do lots of refueling in the air. Right. Landing is not as important as it once was, it's not always a negative. Invasions are not always negative. Our military involvement is certainly not always negative, but.
How does that relate, though, to what the Founding Fathers wanted? I mean, they had a pretty non-interventionist point of view. They did go after, the pirates who were kind of taking over American commerce ships, but largely they had a non-interventionist point of view. Now we've invaded 44% of the planet. What's the comparison? What would they be thinking right now?
Well, it is very different from the Founding Fathers. And George Washington certainly was more hands-off guy. No entangling alliances. He certainly talked about, and so that it has been a dramatic change. But at the same time, we have been involved with invasions very early on in our country. We talked about in their book the very first American invasion we classified as happening in 1741 in Colombia, which was long before we were even a country. But there were Americans participating. This is during the War of Jenkins' Year, and we invaded Colombia with Admiral Vernon was in charge, was the commanding officer, and this is a war between the Spanish and the British. And one of the participants was a gentleman by the name of Lawrence Washington, who was the older half-brother of George. And it wasn't a successful operation, but he did speak highly enough to his commanding officer that George Washington ended up naming his home Mount Vernon in honor of Lawrence Washington's commanding officer. So there's a connection between our very first invasion and our founding fathers and George Washington.
Wow, that's I would bet most Americans don't know that. I mean, that's one of those lost pieces of history.
I think that's true. And we invaded Canada in 1776, and so during the American Revolution, the Founding Fathers were invading Canada. In 1778, we invaded. John Paul Jones made a raid on Whitehaven, which is in what is today England on the Cumbrian coast. And so, very few English people, for instance, know that the last country to raid England were actually Americans in 1778.
Get out.
So we've had this. We're kind of what my British co-author would call a stroppy country, or we're a pugnacious country. We've been fighting around the world for a long time in our history.
How has fighting changed, though? I mean, if we rewound the clock 600 years, when you invaded a country and you won, you took it over. That doesn't seem to be the model anymore. Now you invade a country and you just send in your businesses to kind of take over the economy, but you don't say, okay, well, now Iraq belongs to us, or, whatever. I mean, the British, India was theirs, Australia was theirs. I mean, the sun never set on their empire. But those days are over, aren't they?
Invasions, the nature of invasions and wars, of course, has changed and changed dramatically. I mean, the old days used to say send in the Marines, and today it's with cyber wars and cyber threats. It's send in the nerds instead. I mean because our infrastructure is so much determined by our digital economy, that we have vulnerabilities in ways that we've never had before, and so there is the potential to be aggressive without boots on the ground, without fighting in the conventional sense too. And of course, you alluded to commercial invasions. I mean, or business invasions. Now, I mean that's kind of invasions with quotes around it. But I mean, we pointed out in the book that in China, this year, 2015, there will be 1,500 Starbucks in China. I mean, is that kind of an invasion? Well, I mean, where we're trying to convert people in the 19th century, we were trying to convert the Chinese to Christianity. Many missionaries, American missionaries, were. Today, some are trying to convert them from tea drinking to coffee drinking. The ones that work for Starbucks. So yeah.
Wow. So, but you bring up something interesting, and that's cyber invasion. We've seen China do that against us, and I'm sure we're doing it against China. Why don't we consider those invasions? I mean, if they're taking out infrastructure, if they're preventing economic trade, it'd be the same as taking out a cargo ship.
It's a great question, Josh. I mean, because it is a real threat, and it has been going on for some time. I mean, businesses are affected. The lives and the economies are affected. Jobs can be lost, and I've been involved with a business that was subject to a Chinese cyber attack, actually, personally. So I mean, it's a real problem, and it's very hard to trace, and to find out, to pinpoint exactly who done it, and the ways to try to the attempts to try to find justice for something after the fact are very, very problematic in terms of cyber crimes.
Do you think, though, moving into the future, that those are going to have to be viewed as attacks? Because look at the Sony hack, and now they don't really suspect South or North Korea of doing it. But that hack, whoever was responsible for it, cost over $200 million in damage.
Right.
So would we ever get to this point where we respond militarily because of a cyber attack?
Well, I mean, it depends on the level of attack. I mean, if it's just a question of money, then probably not. Probably more be along the lines of a civil suit rather than a criminal, so to speak. But when you talk about bringing down the whole banking system of a country, and there are some Baltic countries that have been victimized.
Well, sir, stay where you're at. Stay where you're at, and we'll talk about this when we come back. Don't go anywhere, folks. So America's invaded 44% of the Earth. We're involved in well over 100 countries right now as we speak. And we're talking about, what does this mean? I mean, looking back at history, how do we project then into the future? And we're talking with Christopher Kelly. He is the author of America Invades. Christopher, when we look at what we're doing now, and we look at how we've been militarily involved, yes, there's instances like Haiti where we've, helped with disaster relief, but usually we're involved a little more intimately with nations than that. Over the past 40 years, these involvements, these invasions have actually had a negative effect. I mean, it's kind of backfired. Is it time we re-examine our involvement?
I think that could be the case. I mean, we've tried in our book to not be political, we're not writing for one particular political group. We're trying to write for everybody, frankly. Whether you're on the left, right, center, if you're libertarian, I mean, the facts belong to all of us. I mean, about American involvement. Right. The facts should be something that we, can all kind of agree on, and then we can disagree about what the objective is. But you look back to the past. I mean, this is the 2015 marks the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. I mean, which was the worst conflict in human history. I mean, more people killed than ever before. And certainly, and so you'll have in the spring VE Day, 70th anniversary, end of the war in Europe, and then this August, the end of VJ Day, end of the war in Japan, the complete end of the war, and we did play a very important role in the world, I think in trying to, obviously, you also have things like the 70th anniversary of the liberation of the death camps coming up this year, which you'll see a lot of attention to. And so, I think we have to say that we played an important, that the world would be a darker place if we had not done what we did, and all those men and women, and something like 13 million Americans that served in World War II, most of whom are no longer alive. This greatest generation is, no longer with us. I mean, very, very few. You bump into them sometimes, but not, not so much. I mean, the enormous sacrifice that they made. I think we have to acknowledge that too as part of our history.
Oh yeah, and that's kind of where history kind of shifts, because if you look post World War II, as technology changes, as monetary systems of the world change, all of a sudden those military involvements are very rarely something that frees people or liberates people like World War II has, which was kind of that interesting perspective. But tell us a little bit more about that lost history. For example, the Revolutionary War expanded to the Caribbean.
We actually did go into some Caribbean nations even as early as during the American Revolution. I believe Jamaica, that we were involved with them very, very early on, and then Canada as well. Actually, I'm sorry, I think it's not Jamaica, but Bermuda, I believe, was one that we got involved with. Bahamas were involved with very, very early on, but so there is the forgotten history. Another forgotten war is people talk about the Korean War as being a forgotten war. I mean, here so many of your listeners have things like Samsung mobile devices or driving around in Kias and Hyundais, and that is directly
I got two of them right in front of me right now.
There you go. I mean, and they make great products, of course. But I mean, there we owe, in a sense, a debt to Douglas MacArthur, who in 1940 launched an invasion at Incheon, which basically turned around the course of the Korean War, and that otherwise North Korea would have occupied the entire peninsula. And instead of having two Koreas as we have today, you would have had the scary prospect of having having only one totalitarian Korea, and none of the consumer products that we enjoy today. I mean, you would have had just a very, very different world if MacArthur had not done what he did, if Truman hadn't ordered him to do what he did too. So,
any insight as to why the Korean conflict, the Korean War, was that forgotten war? I mean, it's not as if it's over, really. I mean, there's still the DMZ. We still see North Korea in the news on a daily basis. There were shows and movies made out of it, like MASH. But you're right; people just seem to forget it even happened. Why?
It only lasted 3 years. I mean, they were having pretty brutal years at the time. And I think a lot of a reason why it's forgotten, it has to do with the media. It has to do with the fact that in those days, 50 to 2, the war was in black and white. It was a black and white war and not a color war. And so it isn't as vividly recalled as, even the Vietnam War turned into a war that was fought on color television, because color was introduced just prior or even during the Vietnam War, during the early days of the Vietnam War. So I think that plays a part in the way it was too. And the Vietnam War certainly played out on our television screens. And many people say that it was lost in the media too. And when Cronkite after 1968 decided that we could not win the war, that was a turning point in the conflict. So
anything in the book about our involvement in the Middle East? I mean, we've had a lot of involvement going back to World War I that still affects us today.
Sure. we talk a lot. I mean, every country in the world has a chapter, and so
Okay.
every Jordan, Syria. I mean, Syria is brand new involvement that we've had. Saudi Arabia. I mean, there are things about Saudi Arabia we talk about in the book that I think you will find very few places. I mean, that there was an attack by, actually not by us, but by the Italians in 1940. Mussolini bombed from the Isle of Rhodes, bombed oil refineries in Saudi Arabia, even though Saudi Arabia wasn't directly involved as an ally in World War II. They were actually neutral. But they suddenly realized that they needed a protector, and the protector that they turned to was the United States of America. And FDR met the King of Saudi Arabia in 1945, coming back from Yalta in the Suez, and an alliance was formed back then, and the alliance was, providing oil for our military and economic purposes in exchange for protection. And in a way, that bargain that was struck by FDR, the King of Saudi Arabia, endures to this day, in spite of the obviously profound differences between our two countries. So that's
it's
one aspect.
And it's interesting because I agree with you. History belongs to all of the parties. It's not a political thing, but it's hard to look at that and not obviously see how that politically played out in the generations since we struck that deal with Saudi Arabia.
Right. I mean, yeah, and I find it kind of, what it is, it's about providing context, Josh, is that, you can't understand things without context. Here's the thing, is like, I like women, and I think that, women's hair is a beautiful thing, but I don't like to find a woman's hair in my soup. So, that's what I mean by context. It makes a difference. And so the question is, do we have, is what's going on in Syria a beautiful thing, or do we have something else in our soup? Are we in the soup again, so to speak?
Well, okay, so take off your author hat and just put on, your broadcaster hat, your business leader hat. Just
Sure.
Real quickly, what do you think of our involvement in Syria?
I think that, ideally, and maybe I'm being too much of a romantic here, but I think about things like Lawrence of Arabia. I mean, the way that you were able that they, in the First World War, they were able to do things with, Britain was able to do things with to stir up people with relatively little involvement in terms of, Lawrence of Arabia was able to use a little bit less gold and the passions that were there to help to support the Allied efforts against what were the Turks. So today you almost need like a Laura of Arabia or something like that. Covert, lots can be done with covert actions.
You are right. You're right, sir. America Invades. AmericaInvades.com. Get this book, Christopher Kelly.